Welcome to Staffworks Explained. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we'll be talking about Kenya oil, where we argue that Kenya's oil debate needs a reset, and why Angola's Cabinda refinery offers a better model than Lokisha Lamu export pipeline. Kenya's oil strategy is increasingly centered on one objective: moving crude oil from Turkana to coast for export. For years, the proposed Lokisha Lamu crude oil pipeline was presented as the country's gateway into the petroleum exporting league. More recently, policymakers have floated alternatives involving rail transport after the pipeline struggled to attract financing. What has remained largely unchanged is the underlying assumption that Kenya should export crude first and then think about refining it later. That assumption deserves closer examination, and that's what we are doing. Across Africa, oil-producing countries are beginning to confront a long-standing structural weakness: exporting crude oil while importing refined fuel at a higher cost. Angola, despite being one of Africa's largest crude producers, has started shifting away from that model. The Cabinda oil refinery, commissioned in phases beginning in 2025, reflects a broader attempt to retain more petroleum value within the domestic economy. Kenya would be wise to study that approach and do it carefully before committing billions of shillings to infrastructure designed primarily to move unprocessed crude oil out of the country. The Cabinda's refinery first phase processes 30,000 barrels per day, and Kenya could start at that point, and cost approximately 473 US dollars million to construct. That is around 61 billion Kenya shillings. It was reported that in 2024 that the project's second phase could expand to 60,000 barrels per day. Kenya could also do that later. At current exchange rate, the first phase alone represents an investment of 61 billion Kenya shillings. By comparison, the Lokisha Lamu pipeline has been estimated at between US dollars 1.5 billion to $3 billion, depending on the scope and associated infrastructure. This places the likely cost between 190 billion Kenya shillings and 390 billion Kenya shillings. The scale difference matters because the two projects produce very different economic outcomes. A crude oil export pipeline mainly generates transport revenue and export earnings. A refinery, on the other hand, creates downstream industrial activity. It produces various products that is, such as diesel, jet fuel, petrol, heavy fuel oil, bitumen, lubricants, and even feedstocks for manufacturing. It creates demands for storage, logistics, engineering services, maintenance, chemical processing, and port infrastructure. You see, so many benefits. In project management terms, refining creates a broader value chain multiplier than raw material or raw export infrastructure. Kenya already imports nearly all refined petroleum products consumed domestically. According to Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, EPRA, petroleum imports remain among the country's largest imports cost annually. That means Kenya could theoretically export crude oil from Turkana while continuing to import refined diesel and petroleum from abroad. Economically, that is a weak position because the higher value stage of the petroleum chain remains externalized. Angola's recent direction reflects a recognition of this exact problem. Cabinda is intended not only to reduce fuel imports but also stabilize domestic supply and support regional exports. Reports have indicated that the refinery first phase alone is expected to supply roughly 10% of Angola's domestic fuel market for expansion. Uganda appears to have reached a similar conclusion. Kampala continues to pursue the Uganda refinery project in Hoima alongside the East African crude oil pipeline EACOP. The refinery is planned at 60,000 barrels per day with an estimated investment cost of around $4 billion US dollars. Uganda's argument is straightforward. Oil production without refining leaves the country exposed to imported fuel costs and external supply shocks. That position is increasingly contrasts with Kenya's approach. The economics of Lokicha project have already shown signs of strain. Tullow Oil, former partners Total Energies and Africa Oil, exited the Kenya market years ago. There are also reports, and we have covered that in this channel, that Tullow Oil later agreed to sell its Kenya assets to the Gulf Energy after prolonged uncertainty surrounding pipeline economics and commercial viability. Kenya has since explored replacing the dedicated pipeline with a rail-based crude transport system because of the high capital cost involved. This creates an important policy question. If the economies of transporting crude oil to the coast are already under pressure before construction begins, does it still make sense to prioritize export logistics over domestic refining capacity? The issue becomes even more complicated when regional politics are considered. Tanzania has positioned itself aggressively as a petroleum transit corridor through the East African crude oil pipeline EACOP, which is linked to Uganda's oil sector. There has been recurring suggestions about refining expansion near Tanga. Yet, even within Tanzania, the details surrounding some proposed downstream projects remain unclear, and several announcements have moved ahead of formal project implementation structures. In infrastructure planning, lack of alignment between political announcement and institutional readiness is usually a warning sign rather than a sign of momentum. Kenya should avoid repeating that pattern. A refinery strategy does not necessarily mean abandoning export altogether. It means restructuring priorities. A phased refinery, probably near Turkana, would likely deliver stronger long-term economic returns than a single-source export pipeline. Smaller modular refinery systems now allow countries to scale capacity gradually instead of building massive complexes immediately. Nigeria's Walter Smith modular refinery and Angola's phased Cabinda model both reflects this shift toward incremental development. There is also the question of strategic resilience. Recent global fuel disruptions have shown how vulnerable import-dependent economies can become during geopolitical instability. Countries with domestic refining capacity are generally better positioned to manage supply interruptions and price volatility. Kenya experienced this directly during the period of global fuel stress following the Russia-Ukraine conflict, when import costs rose sharply and foreign exchange pressure intensified. From a project management perspective, infrastructure should be evaluated not only by construction costs but also by long-term national value creation. Export pipelines are linear assets. Refineries are industrial ecosystems. One mainly moves raw materials, the other anchors manufacturing, storage, distribution, and industrial growth. Kenya's oil reserves are not large enough to justify expensive prestige infrastructure built around crude exports alone. The smarter path may be to refine a significant share domestically, meet local demand, and target regional fuel deficits in East and Central Africa. That approach aligns better with industrialization goals, reduces fuel import dependence, and keeps more petroleum revenue circulating within the local economy. The central lesson from Angola is therefore not simply that Kenya should build a refinery. It is that resource-producing countries gain more when they move up the value chain instead of remaining exporters of raw materials. For Kenya, that may ultimately prove more important than the pipeline itself. So thank you for reaching this far. If it's your first time here, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can also hit the notification bell so that whenever you upload a new video, you are notified. You can also leave your thoughts about these suggestions, this reset of the debate on focusing more on exporting crude oil than creating value chain within the country. Thank you, and let's meet in the next one.